Keep the mask on. All right, we're going to do it. Welcome. It's so good to have you at Plymouth. Thank you for being here. My name's Elise Higgins. I use she and they pronouns, and I am on the Mission and Service Board, and I'm very excited to be your MC today. How are we liking the pews? Everybody is woo! Are we as socially distanced as we want to be? All right, that's wonderful. How many of you don't go to Plymouth? Just a quick check-in. Okay, well, we're not here to trick you into a church service, I promise, although if you are loosely Protestant and you like good preaching and social justice, I do recommend 9:30 and 11:15, But no, we're thrilled that you're here for an event on voting rights. We are here because it is the work of our faith, right, to leverage our literal physical space and our name and our power to do justice in the community, right? So that's why we're here. And we're also here because we are at a pretty dark moment at all levels of government, with a few exceptions. But particularly in the State House in Topeka, things are not looking so good, with, again, a few exceptions, including Representative Barbara Ballard, who we're thrilled is here today, also in our choir. But Representative Ballard and a small number of other thoughtful people aside, Topeka is really kind of a bad idea factory. And it can feel pretty hopeless, right? But we're here because we genuinely believe that any institution that is created by human beings can be changed by human beings. And the first step of doing that work is to learn what's going on. So that is kind of the purpose of the event today, is to give us a sense of what is going on when it comes to voting rights in Kansas, and to also get a sense of what we can do about it. Voting rights are sort of the issue without which there are no other issues, right? We don't really get to win on anything else if we don't win democracy, right? And we know that voting rights restrictions are specifically evil in a few ways, right? They're explicitly racist, right? They disenfranchise Black and brown and Native voters. They are explicitly opposed to working class people voting, right? Folks who can't stand in line for 7 hours on election day. And also, voting rights restrictions are often very ableist, right? In the way that they restrict mail-in voting and drop-box voting. And I'm not going to get into anything else because I don't want to steal the thunder of our amazing speakers, who are a part of the hundreds of years old long tradition of voting rights struggle in the US. So I am excited to introduce to you Melissa Styler, who is the Advocacy Director at Loud Light. She's a board member at the Cross Border Network and Kansas Interfaith Action, and an all-around stellar human being. And she is here to tell you about what's happening in Topeka and what we can do about it. So let's very quickly give it up for Melissa. Very lovely to have you. We also have people watching on Facebook, and I'm sure that they are also clapping. We've also got Jamie Schube here, truly the man with a plan for Douglas County. He's been our county clerk since 2004, has completely transformed that institution in his tenure, and he has really helped to guarantee the vote in Douglas County, despite awful statewide voting restrictions. He is active in the Election Center, the Kansas Association of Counties, and with the Kansas County Clerks and Elections Officials Association, and he's also a member of Plymouth. So let's hear it for Jamie Schube. Very happy to have both of you here. So some quick logistical notes before we get started. Melissa and Jamie will each speak for a tight 20, and then we'll go back to Melissa, who will share with us some information about how we can take action. And then Noreen Spears, who is in here somewhere, is going to be taking your questions and giving them to me. There's Noreen, thank you so much. And Gretchen is also monitoring Facebook for questions. And so I will sort of gather those questions from these two wonderful people and ask them to you all. So if you do come up with questions while our speakers are kind of giving their presentations, that's wonderful. If you wouldn't mind writing them down on your phone, or I'm not going to tell our pastors if you use the tiny pencils and offering envelopes. Whatever you need to do to write them down. Oh, actually, just kidding. We don't have to use the offering envelopes. Noreen has pens and cards. We'll use those instead. Thank you so much. So That's all I got. Does that sound good? Everybody ready to hear our people? All right. I'm going to turn it over to Melissa.
Good morning, everyone. Hi. So this is my first time speaking in person at Plymouth, and I told Davis Hammett, our executive director, I was coming here today, and he told me a very funny story. That y'all's youth pastor, Pastor Josh Longbottom, had all of the young members of your church go perform an exorcism on the Walmart that was being brought to Lawrence, which I think is pretty incredible. And I'm like, all right, yeah, I can talk to these folks. But yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Melissa Styler. I use she, her pronouns. I am the advocacy director of Loud Light, which is where I am lucky enough to be paid to fight for democracy, but it's not like, you know, I don't know, childhood Melissa is like, I'm gonna fight for fair election administration issues. That's obviously not how I got here. But pro-democracy values is something that has been heavily entrenched in Kansas history and in my own history as well. I come from a long line of union members. My dad's a pipe fitter, and my dad's dad's a pipe fitter, and my dad's 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 a pipe fitter. He's also the youngest boy of 13 kids, and all of his brothers are pipe fitters, and all of his sisters are teachers, so they're all union members too. And, you know, the labor movement is nothing more than having democracy in your own workplace. And my dad would talk about democracy in this very precious kind of way, where he would talk about going and participating in his union as this labor of love for our family, right? He would say, well, I got to go take this contract vote so I can keep a roof over your head. And he'd do the same thing whenever it comes to actual elections, too. He'd say, well, you know, I'm going to vote for the school board member because I want you to have a good education. Actually, my dad's voting booth was at my elementary school, and they had this, like, very precious, like, kids voting booth next to the adult voting booths where they had little ballots for us, and my dad would walk us through the ballots, and you know, I mean, he'd say, like, well, I'm voting for this representative because I want to make sure I'm taken care of when you're older, or whenever I'm older, right? He'd put it in these really practical kind of terms about what democracy is supposed to be. And it was this way that he showed me that he loved me. And then, in a way that he, you know, my mom was certainly like a force to be reckoned with, but my dad's like this salt of the earth Irish Catholic dude, you know? It was a way that he like took care of his family. And so shortly thereafter, whenever my dad was arrested for a nonviolent drug offense, he no longer had that kind of way to take care of us because he lost his right to vote through the felonization process. You know, and none of my younger siblings, I'm the oldest of 5, none of my younger siblings are remotely as engaged in democracy as I was because they were never taught that practical lesson. And so whenever somebody is disenfranchised, whether it's through policy and procedure like my dad was, or through unnecessary barriers like not being able to send in your advance mail ballot on time, restricting the methods of how you're able to vote so that way if you can only vote on election day, you have to wait for 45 minutes or so in this large group of people, which is something that is completely inaccessible to others. If you have these kind of structural barriers, that is disenfranchisement in and of itself as well. And what that is it's the powers that be telling you, you're not good enough. You're not good enough to have a say in your children's school. You're not good enough to have a say in where your taxes are going. So whenever I was given the opportunity to come and fight for folks like my dad, hell yeah, absolutely, of course, happy to do it. Now, I know that things seem pretty bleak right now, but actually, I think that now is a point of true inspiration and of, like, real opportunity. Loud Light was founded not because, you know, this was some kind of long-term strategic plan, but because there was this incredible need. Because whenever our executive director came to Kansas, which I don't know, I assume everybody knows Davis because everyone knows Davis, but our executive director came to Kansas to found the Rainbow House across the street from the Westboro Baptist Church. And what he saw through doing this work is that the people of Kansas don't look anything like its legislature. That all of these laws that are being pushed through and being passed are not what the grand majority of Kansans want. And I truly believe that strength in numbers is the way that we are going to win, and I know that we have those numbers now. So let's go ahead and dive into like the nitty-gritty of like what is actually happening with Kansas now. So I have a couple of notes, but of course I'll go into detail on any of this, in Q&A too, but I'm not going to dive into the weeds because I live in the weeds, I love the weeds, and so I could just go on and on. But I'm sure that it is not a surprise to anybody here that the big lie after the 2020 election is something that the grand majority of people don't believe in the real results of the kind of laws that have been passed since then. So, for example, after the 2020 election, there were over 400 bills that were introduced, anti-democratic voter restrictive bills that were introduced across the country. 17 states passed legislation that restricts voting rights and suppresses the vote, Kansas being one of those states. Now, what was passed last year in Kansas was an omnibus bill. That means that there were a wide variety of things that overhauled our electoral system. Things like restricting how many ballots that one could turn in for advanced mail voting. So like, for example, I work with a group of nuns up in Concordia, Kansas, and it's common practice for them to just put all of their mail-in ballots together and one person takes it to the county clerk's office. That, of course, is illegal now. It's things like restricting who can send you advanced mail ballot applications, and while, some local election officials do a better job at making sure that you all have access to things like advanced ballot applications, many counties don't send you those kinds of applications or notify you that that's an option at all, which is why we have these nonprofit and other outside entities filling this gap of sending advanced mail ballot applications in the first place. And then, of course, you have something that has really struck at my organization and many of our coalition partners as a whole, is you have this very vague statute that felonizes being perceived as an election official. So that is not to say, it's already illegal to pretend, and it has already been illegal to pretend to be an election official, but what they've done now is it's the perception from somebody else. It's the subjective view. That's the part that has been felonized because the language is so vague. Of course, all of these things are going through litigation now, but none of these things are actually a response to any specific issues within our electoral system in Kansas or really anywhere else, right? We know that the 2020 election was one of the most safest, securest, and well-administered elections that this country has ever seen. In the midst of, an incredibly difficult time for folks to be able to go out and do this, election officials really rose to the occasion, and we know that that election was safe and secure here in Kansas as well. And so what we're seeing now, though, is while the voter suppression slate of legislation that passed last session is currently being litigated, we're seeing just last week yet another slate of anti-democratic voter suppression bills being introduced here in Kansas. So there's 8 election bills, in general that's going through the legislature right now. I'll specifically talk about 2 that we're really concerned about. So let me make sure I get their numbers right. So SB 394 requires all advanced voting ballots to be returned by 7 p.m. on Election Day. What this means is whenever you mail in your ballot, there's typically a 3-day grace period so long as you've mailed your ballot on Election Day or before Election Day. So long as it arrives within 3 days of the election, that ballot will count. This eliminates that. So regardless of what's going on with our mail system, which has gotten progressively more slow even since the last election, restricting this kind of time frame is going to be a huge issue in disenfranchising voters. if this law had been in effect during the 2020 election, 32,000 Kansans' votes would have been thrown out for no good reason at all. Again, this isn't a response to any kind of actual bad behaviors or fraudulent activity that's been happening. It is just to limit the number of people who can participate in the system. The other thing that we're also seeing is SB 388. And so what that does is it requires the use of the United States Postal Service to deliver your advance mail ballot. To say this in like a more clear way, this bans the use of ballot drop boxes, and it also bans the use of private delivery services such as UPS or FedEx. Now, personally speaking, I'm a big fan of, of the Postal Service. I think we should be using that. But I do know that I work a lot with college students, out-of-state folks who are still wanting to vote in Kansas because this is their home. And I know that with the attack on the Postal Service that we've seen recently in the 2020 election, we did a lot of work trying to figure out what was the very fastest way students who are going to out-of-state schools could vote in Kansas elections and still get their ballots here on time. And oftentimes that was not the US Postal Service. So whether that is folks who need to overnight their ballot via like UPS, or folks like me who dropped off my advanced mail ballot in one of Douglas County's advanced ballot drop boxes because it was the easiest, most convenient way for me to vote whenever I was just, on my way to the grocery store, right? Both of those things would no longer happen if these bills passed through the legislature. Now, rather than diving into all of the kind of nitty-gritty weeds, I want to talk about why I think these things are happening briefly. And then, I'm sure that we'll get Jamie's perspective on this, and we can then talk about what we want to do about it. I know that these are not popular policies in Kansas, specifically attacking vote by mail. In the 2020 election, 1 in every 3 Kansans voted by mail. It was wildly popular. Wildly popular. And so this isn't just popular with one demographic. Across the political spectrum, across ages, races, geographies, every single county in Kansas had some kind of advanced ballot drop-off option for their vote-by-mail folks. Every single county. This is something that is used all over the place. And also, vote-by-mail is something that has been used in Kansas for decades. This isn't something that is like a brand new feature of elections. This is something that largely was used by rural Republicans for most of its use in Kansas. But as the electorate is spreading and as voting early and voting by mail becomes more popular, we see these attacks. Why are we seeing these attacks if they're not popular? Is because of the dark money and special interest groups that have hold in our legislature. The bills that passed last legislative session and the bills that are being put forth this legislative session have all been crafted by the same dark money group, which is called Opportunity Solutions Project. It's based out of Tallahassee, Florida. It's a multi-million-dollar organization where its donors are not public at all. And it started doing lobbying in Kansas after the 2020 election, even though its primary mission has nothing to do with voting rights. What Opportunity Solutions Project is it's part of the Heritage Network, the Heritage Foundation network of a variety of different groups that are kind of these anti-welfare puppet organizations. So Opportunity Solutions Project predominantly has focused on things like restricting food stamps and any kind of welfare to work programs. That kind of stuff has been their bread and butter. And those kinds of things are also not very popular here in Kansas. They call this type of legislation barriers to work. But what we know it to be true is it is an attack on those who are suffering from systems of poverty. We know that this is an attack on families. We know that this is an attack on people who have limited mobility issues and disabilities. We know that this is not just about, we know that this isn't just about getting people to work, right? But those policies are not popular in Kansas, so the only way that they can win on these issues is by restricting the institutions of democracy and our ability to speak out about this. And Opportunity Solutions Project isn't the only one. There's a number of different special interest and dark money groups that participate in the Kansas legislature to be able to push these things. For example, last year, after the what they're calling Value Them Both, but what is inevitably going to lead to a constitutional amendment that allows the banning of abortion, after that piece of legislation was pushed through by Kansans for Life, the next thing they immediately picked up, their number one legislative priority after pushing that through, was the slate of voter suppression bills that we saw coming through the state. I was pretty surprised, actually, at how quickly and how the legislature handled these voter suppression bills last year, because it was pretty unusual. But whenever you have an organization that is quite well funded by a bunch of dark money, that even a moderate Republican or somebody who isn't anti-choice, a legislator who says, well, this has nothing to do, these voter suppression bills, they don't have anything to do with this, right? Even like anti-choice legislators who just don't want to restrict democracy. They said, well, we want Kansans to actually be able to vote for this. Whenever you have a dark money group like Kansans for Life threatening to throw down as much money as they possibly can to defeat that person if they don't toe the party line, then you have these kinds of voter suppression bills coming through. So that way, whenever the constitutional amendment does come up this upcoming August, the methods that we have to vote in that election are going to be much more difficult than if these voter suppression laws hadn't taken place. And the last thing I'll touch on a little bit about kind of the hurdles that I see happening right now is really the breaking of the democratic institution that is like the Kansas government as a whole. We see this through the redistricting process. So I'm sure being here in Lawrence, considering like we Lawrenceans are kind of mixed up in what's going on with this gerrymandered maps. So I'm confident that most of you have at least heard or seen something about this. But to summarize very briefly, Ad Astra 2 map, which is what they named the different types of maps that they push through for how we're going to draw our congressional districts. The one that was introduced by Senate President Ty Masterson, though we actually have no idea who drew this map, it was introduced a week ago, and from a week of being shown to the public, even without any kind of data analysis or any information whatsoever, within a week, that was passed through the entire legislature, and it's now sitting on Governor Kelly's desk to see if she'll sign this into law or she'll veto this. Now, that's not how the legislative process is supposed to do things, but what we see is committee chairs that only allow votes and debate and conversation about bills that they personally support, and we see leadership breaking rules of the legislature and really harming the institution of the legislature itself by doing things like calling an emergency so they can immediately push bills through to be able to pass on the floor, rather than actually having the kind of debate and the time that legislators should have to look at what's going on. And so whenever they're fast-tracking all of these things and just pushing out these anti-voting policies and anti-democratic laws, they don't care the long-term impact that it has on the actual institution of democracy itself. And so I guess I'll pause there, all dark and twisty and everything, but I promise we'll talk about that I do think that there's hope in just a little bit.
And before we hear from Jamie, I do want to name that Representative Ballard is our representative on the Redistricting Committee. She's the only person of color on that committee as well. So we'd love to hear from you if you want to share afterward about what that work has been like. So thank you, Jamie.
Good afternoon. I know there's a few other things going on, like a football game and stuff, so I'm thrilled that you're here. Actually, my child is part of the LHS production of Mamma Mia, and their show starts at 2. And so many parents are going there because we have a feeling that it may be lightly attended. But so my name is Jamie Schube. My pronouns are he, him, and I am an election official. And I feel like I need to confess that I would be a lapsed member of Plymouth. It's been a while since I've been here. So I actually wrote 2 speeches. The one is the one most of you have probably heard me talk about. And then one was a little personal. And I actually made the decision as I was walking in which one I was going to give. And so it's on my phone. It's not actually printed out. A couple years ago, I was on the phone with county clerks across Kansas, election officials across the country, and we were trying to figure out, what do we do? We were going into the pandemic and we were shutting everything down, we were still going to work. And we were still trying to figure out, I don't know how we're going to run an election. I mean, for some of my peers, they were running an election within a month of when everything shut down. Luckily for Kansas, we weren't going until August, and so we could kind of learn from them. But, it wasn't just the nuts and bolts, but it was, how do we protect our staff? How do we protect our poll workers? After each election in 2020, I held my breath for a couple weeks, worried that I had been a super spreader event somewhere and I had endangered my poll workers. And then for us also, how do we protect our families, right? We were out there and we were interacting with people. And so there was a lot of stuff that we were trying to do. And Melissa, astutely pointed it out. What happened was we not only pulled it off, we pulled it off with very few health crises among our staff, our voters, and our poll workers, with the largest turnout in our country's history. And for Douglas County, we had the largest. I was shocked as we got closer to 60,000. I really didn't think that we would cross 60,000 as long as I'm clerk. And we passed 60,000 and we kept going. And it was pretty impressive. I don't know if many of you saw during the canvass, I got a little emotional when I spoke about it because of what the staff had done, what the poll workers had done. A few months ago, I belong to a number of national committees on elections, and I went to a meeting that we had, which just so happened to be in Maricopa County, Arizona. We had planned that years ahead of time. We had to go through multiple layers of security to get into our meetings. There was a police presence at our meetings. We sat around and talked about and told the stories of the threats that our staffs have dealt with. Colleagues of mine who cannot put their trash out in front of their homes because people are digging through their trash convinced they can find the conspiracy, right? I have colleagues of mine that still need to be escorted into their offices by sheriff's deputies. And so, as I look at it, that's our thanks. For everything we pulled off, that's the thanks that we've gotten. You don't hear a lot of talk about what was amazing and pulled off in 2020. Instead, you hear about all the other stuff. Nationwide, the statistic is 30% of election officials are going to retire or resign in the next year. We did a poll in Kansas, 25% of the county clerks are leaving this year. A friend of mine in a county announced that she was leaving, and she hadn't talked about it, and so I called her. I said, where are you going? And she said, as I crossed over into 2022, I mentally could not take it. I couldn't look forward to it. And this is beyond the topic, but I will tell you this, that there is a mental health crisis among people who run elections. We spend a lot of time on the phone talking to each other, just trying to talk each other through the day to come back the next day. And so that's kind of the very personal part of this speech, which is, this is not okay. And I'll be honest, we're not okay. And, when I became clerk in 2005, I knew that there were some things that, needed to happen. The Help America Vote Act had been passed, and I knew that there was going to be, kind of some things we needed to do, but I really didn't anticipate what the next 17 years would be like. I believe we are at one of the most crucial points in our republic's history as it deals with elections. And where we end up, I think, is still being written. So let me kind of talk about that. First of all, what most people don't realize is elections are the greatest example of federalism. There is no national elections board. There is no national elections thing that tells me what to do. Even at the state level, the Secretary of State can provide guidance, but it is the 105 county clerks and election officials that actually run elections in Kansas. And that's the way it is across the board. It's actually being referred to as kind of hyper-federalism. So you have all of these legislators that are passing laws, but in the end, it's at the local level that this is being done. And, in that time, the Help America Vote Act, first of all, was a fantastic response to the 2000 election that opened up elections, especially for persons with disability. Transparency. When I talk about this stuff, I don't want you to think that I say you shouldn't question what happens in elections. You should. That is your right. And you should say what's behind the curtain. But the biggest part that happened was in 2008, Crawford versus Marion County happened, and it opened the door to voter ID. And up to that point, the Supreme Court had been very clear that they had kind of erred on the side of the voter, but they said that there is a point where the state has to kind of protect the vote. But they didn't define what that point was. And so each state kind of jumped out and did their own thing. Kansas passed voter ID. And I will tell you this, we probably have one of the better voter ID laws in the country. We allow student IDs, which Tennessee does not, Texas does not. We have a pretty broad acceptance of IDs. We actually put in that any government can issue an ID, so that's where we came up with we were one of the first in the country to do the Douglas County voter ID. So if you don't have an ID, we'll come to your house, take your picture, issue you an ID, and that's not a barrier for you to vote. But there were a lot of other things that kind of happened if you haven't followed it. I mean, like, there's a case called Intertribal, which was about Arizona, and what it said was, Justice Scalia said, there could be different laws for federal elections and state elections, and that could be okay, and that's the discussion of the two-tiered system. So there was a discussion in Kansas about whether you would get two separate ballots, and there would be different rules on those ballots, which was about the time I was figuring out what my new job was going to be. That was a joke. I mean, I'm trying to lighten it up a little bit. In 2013, Shelby versus Holder, the most interesting thing was they got rid of preclearance from the Voter Rights Act. And Justice Roberts actually said, we don't need this anymore because there is no more suppression, and no one is being denied the right to vote, which is actually quite laughable. In 2016 and 2018, we were dealing with a lot of threats. And the threats were, we spent a lot of time talking about threats to our systems. Foreign actors trying to get into the voter registration systems. And it was real. It was happening, right? Actually, Illinois and Florida, they did get into the voter registration systems. They didn't really do anything while they were in there. So what happened, one of the last things the Obama administration did was in 2016, they declared elections critical infrastructure. So what that meant was the DHS can now get involved. And so critical infrastructure is banks, roads, institutions which have to be protected no matter what. So it's been interesting as remember I said we are federalism. It's been interesting as the federal government kind of figures that out. One of the first meetings we had with DHS, they kept saying, who told me what to do? Because they're from the federal government. They're used to a hierarchy. And I said, nobody, like the people, and they really struggled with there was no hierarchy. One of the things that the foreign actors learned was they don't have to directly attack the election systems. All they have to do is make us do the work for them. And that's what they did. In 2020, they created bot farms, and those bot farms just spent their time on Twitter and Facebook feeding misinformation about elections, and then we did the work for them. I mean, I have relatives that were passing stuff about elections, and when I would try to say that's not true, people who have known me my entire life said that I was wrong, right? Because the internet told them. I mean, one of the most scary things was we could watch it happen when we started getting phone calls. And this is on all sides of the political spectrum, phone calls about advanced ballots and stuff. All I'd had to do was go look at Twitter and see what misinformation had happened that day. And there's some really cool stuff that shows it happens within minutes. All the Russian bot farms had to do was just put it out there, and within minutes, it was at millions and millions of reshares. And so one of the things that's kind of disheartening is that when we talk about misinformation and malinformation, they've learned they don't have to put a lot of work into it because we just do it for them. You know, Melissa talked about, so legislators are now doing reform, right? And I use reform in air quotes. And so they have all this legislation to talk about a reform, but they're not talking about a lot of the things that truly are barriers to voting. So the first one's bureaucracy. We are a government, we're very bureaucratic. The biggest barrier to voting is voter registration, especially for 18 to 24-year-olds. In Douglas County, that's a huge thing that we deal with because we are so transitory. We have so many brand new voters coming in every year, and we have deadlines, right? But going back to federalism, each state is different. So 40% of voters now live in a state that has same-day registration or automatic voter registration. Automatic voter registration, you're 18, you're registered to vote. The onus is not on the voter to be registered, the onus is on the government. We have more people who are not able to vote in Douglas County because they come from same-day registration states, and they think that's what the rule is everywhere. They show up on election day to vote, and we said, no, it was actually 21 days before that you had to be registered, right? And so we talk about in our office also the secret handshake of elections. We assume that everyone knows when you walk into a polling place, who do you talk to? When we give you a ballot, what do you do with the ballot, right? Well, not everybody knows that. We have brand new citizens. We have brand new 18-year-olds. We have, and it's confusing and it's daunting. And to me, that keeps a lot of people from voting because it's scary, right? And you don't want to ask the question because you feel like it's something that you should know. Something we talk about in our office is limited literacy. And so when we write things, most of us have graduated from college, but not everybody in our community has graduated from college. So when we say it's really simple to just read the brochure and figure out how you register to vote, it's not that simple. And so it's really important that we address those things. So ballot language is in law, and it is horrible. It was written by the legislature. It is not simple. And so if you notice on our ballots, the official language that I'm required to put on the ballot it's really small, and then I write it in really easy language. You can ignore what I'm supposed to put on there, right? Mark your oval, and if you make a mistake, ask us. That's what the legislature has us say in a huge paragraph. The biggest concern for me right now is loss of trust in the system. The Pew Center recently showed where they did a survey of people 18 to 24 years. 26% said that they did not feel it was important to choose your own leaders. They did not believe that voting was actually that important. And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense because their entire life, 18 to 24-year-olds, so post-2000, the messages that they have heard is elections broken, everybody's crooked, your vote doesn't count. So why would they support the system, right? And the problem with that is if you lose faith in the system, and we're going to talk about this here in just a second, it is the fundamental thing that drives everything, right? A few years ago, Kansas declared itself a constitutional carry state, which means that the Second Amendment is so important there should be no law that impedes your ability to carry a gun. What if we were a constitutional vote state? which there should be no law that says that you are impeded from voting. Because I can tell you this, your right to carry a gun, your right to free speech, all of those do not matter if that fundamental right disappears. And when you talk about my vote doesn't count, in August of 2020, we had a county commission race that was decided by 3 votes. We also had one of the largest participations of 18 to 29-year-olds in a primary, a city that small of a primary, than I've ever had. They've had an impact on that race. And so I always bring that up. You know, technology is good. We talked about it can be bad with misinformation stuff, but we try to use it the best we can. We were the first in Kansas to do a system called Ballot Scout. So you can now track your ballot kind of like you do your Amazon package as it goes through the mail stream, and you can know where it is. It's really cool. I can see where it is because I can see what's coming back to us. And if something's stuck, I spent some time in 2020 calling the Kansas City Post Office saying, it looks like my ballots aren't moving. Where are they? And they're like, they're on a pallet. I'm like, they need to be moving. So that was really cool because one of the things, so I was one of the people that pushed the 3-day window to Friday because I don't know if you noticed, you don't really get mail on Tuesday anymore. The post office has changed their system first. All of the mail has to go to a processing center. So for Kansas, our mail goes to Kansas City, North Platte, Nebraska, or Amarillo, Texas. It has to. If you're in Greeley, Kansas, and you're mailing to grandma, it's got to go to North Platte, Nebraska, and come back. And they don't process on the weekends, so the post office refers to it as No Mail Tuesday. Well, Tuesday's election day. So if that law goes into effect about 7 o'clock, it will disenfranchise a ton of votes because I get ballots on the Wednesday after the election that were mailed 10 days before from Lawrence. So it wasn't the voter that did it, right? They mailed it within 10 days. They thought that was enough time, and it should be enough time. I will say this, we have an amazing relationship with our post office here in Lawrence. They work really hard for us, even as there were some edicts that said that they shouldn't be doing some things. They told me they were going to ignore it, and they were still going to move my ballots and make sure that, you know, they would be taken care of. So I don't want to knock the, you know, that type of stuff. But election security has changed. So we have a really cool new office. One of the things that I love the courthouse is an amazing place. It is not built for the 5th largest voter population in the state to vote. If you've ever voted in the rotunda on a big election, first of all, it's not COVID friendly. Second of all, the lighting isn't very great. And so we are now, elections is now in the malls, kind of opposite Westlake, with an amazing facility that has a ton of space. It has changed our operation, but it also has allowed me to secure elections in a way that I couldn't in the courthouse. So I have cameras, I have alarms. We were a pilot project in November to be the first in the country to use RFID tags to know that if a piece of equipment leaves our building, and we could track our equipment while it's deployed. And it worked, and it was great. But so there is ways that you can use technology, but when we built that facility, we had to change the way we looked at it. Is how many panic buttons do we have? Is the glass that we have, break-proof? Because when you talk and hear about threats against elections, it may not be as bad as it is in Arizona and so forth, but it is here in this county also. And my staff has been threatened. My family's been threatened. My poll workers have been threatened. This is not just something where you can sit there and go, this isn't our problem. It truly is everybody's problem. Kind of to end a little bit is we talked about voting as a right. And I always talk about is voting, the underlying question that is underneath all of these laws and everything is voting a right or a privilege, which I think is crazy because I thought we solved that in the 1960s, right? But evidently we haven't. There are people I have been in places in Kansas where if you ask the question, is voting a right or a privilege, they'll say it's a privilege. If voting's a privilege, you give people like me the authority to decide whether you get to vote. If you want something interesting, go Google the Louisiana literacy test and take it. It was given up until the 1960s. And the test wasn't about whether you understood the Constitution. It said things like, draw a circle within a circle. Well, then it was given to somebody who looked like me, who then decided whether that was a real circle or not, or you get to vote. And I didn't decide whether you drew a real circle. I looked at you and decided whether you get to vote. So when you talk about voting as a privilege, then you're talking about that. And I've already touched on it, but if voting truly is a right, then we treat it like a right and we protect it like a right. We as a country have got to decide on which side we're going to be. Because as long as we allow that question to kind of be out there, we allow a lot of this stuff to just kind of happen. You know, we have worked really hard to overcome barriers. We've worked hard, you know, if the legislature passes something, what are the ways that our office can, if we can't get rid of the law, we can at least put a ramp on it so that people can fly over it, right? That's part of what our job is supposed to be. Recently, the Colorado-Kansas County Clerks Association put out a statement. And in that statement, they said the purveyors of disinformation have had their moment, and that moment is now over. That is what the challenge is for you, and the challenge is for groups that focus on like voter ID and stuff like that. This is bigger than that, which it is time for all those election officials to feel like they're on their own, to hear from their community that they're supported, that their offices are supported, and then to speak back to the legislature. Because right now, the only voices in the legislature are the most extremes, and they're feeding the big lie, right? We need people like you who are not involved in that to suddenly speak up and say, our system needs to be protected. I always end all of my speeches with, if you've never watched LBJ's speech on civil rights, you should. The guiding part of how I do my job is his quote, that our fathers believed that if the noble view of the rights of man is to flourish, it must be rooted in democracy. And the most basic right of all is the right to choose your leaders. We cannot and we must not refuse to protect the right of every American to vote in every election that he may desire to participate. That should be our guidance from this point on, because I can tell you 2022 is going to be just as bad as 2020. And so it's time to kind of step up for that.
All right, let's hear it for Dave. Elise, turn the mic on. You turned it off. This one's good to go. Go
Okay,
hand it.
very good. Makes sense.
my mic is on. Okay, so now that you've heard about how terrible things are, let me tell you how we're going to fix it. So my job is like looking at the situation as it stands and engaging with our communities all across the state of Kansas about what we can do about it. Loud Light is titled Loud Light, like its name is derived from not just the reflection of us thinking deeply, learning about what the problems are, thinking about our role in systemic injustice, and I'm speaking, I don't know about Facebook, but in this group, I'm looking at like a predominantly white audience, and so like to my fellow white people, we do a lot of like work kind of reflecting on our own role in things, and not as much work on actually taking action to change things, right? And so Loud Light, its name is to hopefully inspire you all to be a visible, vocal force for good. Visible and vocal, right? And there's a couple of ways we can do that. There's 3 general paths to victories whenever we're looking at any given types of policy, especially civil rights policy, which, you know, voting rights, I would say very much so falls under that. So we have a local, a legislative, and a legal path to victory. Us as humans ourselves, our number one focus should be on the local path. Now, that doesn't just mean engaging with your local election officials, such as in Douglas County, we've got Jamie, county clerks in most places, and election commissioners in the 4 largest counties. It's not just engaging with them, though of course I think that is important. Volunteering to be poll workers is important. Engaging on a local level within the election process as a whole is important. But it is also the number one question I get from my fellow well-meaning white folk is they say, what can we do about rural Kansas? Do I place ads on the radio, or how do I even talk to those folks and try to just please convince them that the big lie is a lie in and of itself, right? What can I possibly do for that? And I always tell them the same thing. I say, rural Kansas is fine. Maybe you should talk to your brother, right? Talking to your friends, your family, your neighbors, the people within your own community, not just about the misinformation that's going on, and not just about making sure that we have a pro-voter, pro-democratic culture, but to hold each other accountable of not just holding these beliefs internally, but taking action collectively on these beliefs together. That comes through organized people. I know that talking about special interest groups, we hear, Kansans for Life is a great example. I myself am a Catholic person, so this isn't even about whether you're anti or pro-choice, but it's a matter of the power that's wielded in really unhealthy and anti-democratic ways. You've got strong anti-choice legislators who will vote for things that they don't believe in because Kansans for Life says that they'll postcard every voter in their district and call them a baby killer, right? They've got money like that, but they don't have votes like that. Organized people can outvote any of these special interest groups any day of the week. But democracy doesn't just happen on election day. It happens year-round through the kind of community engagement and organizing work that we're doing within our own communities, and through the legislative session. So I guess I'll go into legislative stuff in just a bit, but I will say, with my KIFA hat on a little bit too, I also sit on the Kansas Interfaith Actions Board because faith-based organizing in Kansas is one of the most important things that we can collectively do. Congregations are organized, powerful groups of people who, and faith-based voices, hold a tremendous amount of weight in local and legislative decisions because, frankly, faith-based voices, like we can bring this moral clarity to the situation that is just so gravely missing from these conversations. And I'm sure that I'm preaching to the choir whenever I say that the grand majority of Kansans, including Kansans of faith, share these pro-democracy values. But our voices, these faith-based voices, have been co-opted by a small but loud minority. And so again, I'm happy to talk about faith-based advocacy specifically, but as a congregation, calling on each other to speak up and advocate for your values is important and necessary. I've given this spiel to a bunch of congregations, and I'll say that I do get a little pushback because they say, well, we're a 501c3, or I don't know if we can get into the weeds on legal policy. But the thing is first of all, talk to some folks about what your C3 status actually lets you do, because yes, you can and should be advocating. I right now live in C3 and C4 nonprofits, and all I do is advocate, right? Advocating and educating is part of your duty, but also acting on your values is putting your faith into action. And so we have a moral obligation to do that. And so I encourage you all to, if your congregation isn't already taking collective action together, that is local organizing, and that is how we can build power. On a legislative note, I know that our legislators here in Douglas County, accountability isn't the conversation that we should be having here, right? Of course, all elected officials are accountable, but I don't really see the kind of disconnect between legislators who are representing Douglas County versus some other places in Kansas. But what I will say is you still need to be talking to your legislators and sharing this kind of moral compass for a couple of reasons. So it gives them backup and support whenever they're talking to their colleagues. It lets them know what the top priorities are and what they like. There's a lot of fights that happen through the legislature. It lets them help kind of tip what their priority levels should be there. But I will also say, supposedly, those who are in leadership answer to the entire state. And so you should be reaching out to those who are in leadership to talk about the breaking of the democratic institutions. We should be having conversations about the fact that the legislature is broken in so many ways, and start holding leadership accountable for those bad decisions that are breaking our democratic institutions, and saying it clearly and as such. And the last thing I'll kind of briefly touch on, and I want to be so incredibly clear because my organization is involved in a few lawsuits, that this is not legal advice, and I don't read into this too much. I'm not talking about any particular lawsuits. I'm just speaking about law, using the legal system as an advocacy strategy. Anytime that you have litigation going on about whether that's voting rights or any other given kind of legislation, looking at the circumstances in which those bills were passed is part of that process. And so, looking at, hypothetically speaking, and again, this is totally hypothetical. I'm not hinting at anything here, so don't read into it. But looking at our redistricting process, looking at how quickly it happened with the incredible limited amount of knowledge, with an incredible amount of backlash from the citizens of Kansas, putting all of that into context and being so remarkably clear to where a judge would be able to see that, and if the legislature needed to answer for that one day, they would have to say, well, we chose to ignore what Kansans were saying and pass this very unpopular law because of this reason. They have to answer for that. And so, again, being visible and being vocal is going to help in every single strategy of victory moving forward. And so I guess I'll leave you all with that to say, We have so many options. We just have to move on them.
Maybe this
Yeah,
one is
so
on?
it's on. All right. I'll do this quickly so that you're able to get to your questions. Our redistricting committee was assigned by Democrats leadership and Republican. I also serve on the Democratic leadership. We each elect 6 people within our own parties to make sure that the rest of the people are getting their needs met. There's 17 people on the redistricting committee. There are 5 Democrats. Now, you do it in terms of the majority and everything else. I think most of you know in August 9 through 13, we actually did a tour around the state. We had 14 stops. The lights on me? Are you trying to tell me I have a halo behind me? Yes. Is this better? Thank you. So we had 14 stops. Remember, this tour was put together very quickly within a week. We were not, as Democrats, consulted. It was just the dates were announced, and we said, fine, we'll show. It was before you had the results of the census, so we really didn't know what the growth was like in any of the counties or anything else, but we went around, we asked him. So part of the 14 was very diverse. We started in Manhattan, and we went all the way from like to Salina, Colby, Dodge City, and we worked our way up Pittsburgh, Hutchinson, worked our way all around Pittsburgh, came back, and our last stop was Lawrence. Doing that, it's a listening, and I'm going to emphasize, it was a listening tour. And we listened to what they had to say. Many of them said, keep the maps safe. Make sure you try to keep math whole in as much as you can. Make sure there's some connectedness between the groups, the compactness of the group. And these were rules that were established that we were supposed to be monitoring and looking at those as well. Shortly after we finished our tour, the census came out, and we said we would have another tour. Well, what we ended up doing was we did it virtually. So we were on Zoom, and we listened to some additional people and everything else. Again, the same thing, compactness, don't separate communities, leave Wyandotte and Johnson County together. And we went through all of this that went, was repeated everywhere. Nowhere did we go say separate the city of Lawrence from Douglas County. They focused more on Wyandotte County, Johnson County. Wyandotte County has the largest diverse population pretty much in the state. Johnson County has the most money coming in, over 35% of tax dollars. And they went from 3 Democratic legislators to 13. So that tells you something about the growth in the Democratic Party and what was going on. So a lot of what Jamie, a lot of what Melissa was saying are really true. People are concerned about lots of things. But we talk all the time about we need a bigger voter turnout. We need a more diverse turnout and everything else. Well, we got it, and they panicked. We got a very diverse, we got a very large turnout, and that made people nervous, not just in Kansas. And then when Georgia did what Georgia did, oh, now people were really like, oh, Lord, what are we going, excuse me, Lord, what are we going to do, and that kind of thing. So it started already, the 400 pieces of legislation, what you wanted to do and everything else. But I just want to say that 18 to 24-year-olds, we have worked extremely hard. Part of my job at the Dole Institute of Politics is to do voter registration, get the students excited about it. You start voting early, you will vote, and so we look at that. So when we're looking at what happened, we met in our meetings Monday, the maps. We want to talk about the map. You're right, the map was introduced in a week. Well, on Monday when we met, just this past Monday, we said, now, wait a minute, let's identify where did these maps come from. In fact, Representative Probst from Hutchinson and I have a map in there. First of all, I'm going to start by saying there is no way you can draw a perfect map. someone is going to be on the losing side. We know that. 20 years ago, we were there. They split Iowa. For those of you that are brand new, Iowa Street, straight down in a half. We were in third, and one half, east stayed third. Everything west of Iowa was second. So they split us. And we didn't know if anyone had split a whole, district just right down the middle, but they did that 20 years ago. Here we are now, 20 years ago. 20 years now. And it's like, okay, we're going to split the city of Lawrence and put in the 1st district, but the rest of Douglas County will stay in the 2nd. One of the things we talked about, and I did an analogy on the House floor Tuesday when I did the floor speech on this, was it's like having a big family, because that's what your district is. It is a family. We depend on each other and what we're going to do and everything else. So you take one part of that family and say, now you're going to move over here, and the rest of you fend for yourself and stay over here. So when we look at that, it does not make sense. It doesn't make sense at all. Western Kansas, we understand, is losing population, and eventually, if they continue, they will lose representation. So that's their big worry. So if you add almost 95,000 people to your district, it just beefed you up. And now you have two. You have K-State and you have KU coming in that district. So you see, that's the problem we were looking at. So now you dilute the vote. You get rid of a lot of the minority vote from Wyandotte County. And now you're going to add 3 conservative districts to Johnson County. You're going to do Miami, Anderson, and what's the other one? Franklin. So you're going to put them there. So now when you look at it, my point is, and I made it, and it was made on the tour, that there are lots of other ways you can draw a map. But just to do ad astra 2, and that's what you push, that's what the Senate pushed, that's what we got. We had 6 maps. We didn't hear anything about the other 5. Only 1. So there's lots of ways you could have split it. We know Wyandotte has too many people. We know they have to get rid of some. We have some of the districts you have to get rid of. But there's lots of ways you can do it. You didn't have to come back to Lawrence twice. My point was, you don't like the way we vote. You don't like the stance we take. Well, who said we liked how you vote? But we've never said anything about taking it away from you. So that, to me, is what the issue is all about. And that was just a congressional map. We haven't gotten to the individual state, 125 districts that we have to deal with. So I think it's going to be an ongoing fight about what really happens and what can we do. Well, what happened before? The states drew the maps. And people were upset about it. The state wasn't happy. The courts weren't happy. They didn't want to do it. That's not their job. That's our job. Our job is to balance the budget and every 10 years answer to the census. So that's where our problem really is, of them trying to keep everything compact, trying to protect a district for, I'll call no names, but for a candidate they wish to keep and one that they wish to get rid of for whatever reason. And it has nothing to do with we have to lose numbers. We understand we have to lose numbers, but we don't have to lose them the way they want us to lose it, or dilute the minority vote, or do a whole combination of things. We really don't have to do it that way. You have 5 people fighting for you, and then the rest of the Democrats are fighting as well. If the courts step in, we'll have to see what happens as a result of that. But we shouldn't have to do that. When we say voting is important, everyone, every American citizen should vote. Make it easy for them to vote. But that's not what they want to do. It's power, keep what we want, and the rest of you, it doesn't really matter. And for that we say it makes no logical sense to go with a map that violates Native American tribes, minorities, all of that, just to have power and stick someone in an area. Did I not say compactness? In an area that we don't have that much in common. Everyone knows it, and they'll look and say, well, this is the best map. And what I said to them was, that's the way you see it. We all know what you're doing. You know what you're doing. Why don't you own up to it? It makes no logical sense.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Elizabeth. Thank you. I have in my hands, thank you very much. We need to hear the word from the inside of the State House, particularly someone who is on the Redistricting Committee and has been seeing it this whole time. I have 4 excellent questions in my hands. Thank you so much for gathering them up. Before I get to those questions, James Minor with the Lawrence Branch NAACP wanted to say a few words. So a few words, and then we'll get to the questions here.
Thank you. I'll try to be short. The Lawrence Branch NAACP has been actively involved in a lot of the activities in Lawrence, Kansas, in Douglas County. We have forums, we have voter registration, and we really drive to drive awareness within the constituents and the voters within this community, as well as the students on the KU campus. We're active on that. We really push hard that the most important thing is voter education. The most important thing is voter registration. First, you got to be able to re-register to vote. Second thing is you got to know who you're voting for. If you don't know who you're voting for, you need to know who you're voting for. And this is an example of why it's important that we must know who we're choosing. So we're recommending that we call, write, email, or text the politicians that support this type of redistricting. And what we say to them is, we oppose the redistricting of Douglas County. Plain and simple. We oppose that. We oppose that politician opposes not approving the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill. We are against you not recognizing improvements to gun rights. We oppose various other activities in regards to voting that helps make Lawrence, Kansas, and the state of Kansas a better state and a better community. When we do that, and I recommend that everyone sitting here pass that on to other individuals that are not here, to go out there and call these politicians within the state of Kansas. Think about the Build Back Better plan. How it'll be, well, we're not still discussing it, but we were having this infrastructure being helped and taken care of if we had the right politicians that had the right thoughts in mind. So what we want to do is for you, those individuals here in this room and those online, is to make that point to these politicians. When they hear that, finish by telling them that they have lost your vote. That's the main thing that gets across. When they start seeing thousands of individuals calling, writing, and texting and saying you have lost their vote, that means that the next time that they go to the polls, they may not have your vote. What that also means is that we must remember, because they're taking advantage of our lack of memory. What is going to happen in 2022 may be forgotten in 2024. So we have to be able to say we are not forgetting what is happening here. Hopefully, by the time 2024 gets here, we will have that. We'll still have the things in place, and we won't have this redistricting problem going on because we won't have that problem. So please, pass it on to your individuals. If you meet somebody, because this is what I do, and this is what our organization does, and this is what our committee does. When we run across an individual that is interested in voting, is not registered, we recommend them. Go to voter.411.org. Go to the NAACP, the League of Women Voters. Go to these sites or go to Jamie Shue's office. and speak to the nice individuals there and get the information that's needed to get registered to vote. A lot of people don't realize in the course of a year, it's over 500,000 minutes that we're allowed. 500,000. But it only takes 30 minutes to vote. That's what happened to me. I went right down to the courthouse. I walked in. I'm a registered voter. I walked in there. I filled out my ballot. I circled. I filled in the dots, and I went home. 30 minutes. That's not a lot of time in 1 year. So encourage those individuals, and if they have pushback, if they're not getting the message, show them your sticker if it's that time of the year and say, I voted. If you can vote, I can vote. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great to hear from the NAACP. We appreciate you. So, James has told you to contact your legislators. Representative Ballard has as well. So has Melissa, so has Jamie. And the great news is you don't have to go anywhere or do anything to get contact information for your legislators because the mission board is hooking you up. So one of the questions that I got on note cards also addressed, who do we call? Is there contact information? And there is. So this is a list of all the legislators in Douglas County, along with their contact information and how they voted on voting rights restrictions and redistricting so far in the legislative session. And all of this information is available in the table in the narthex. So as you're leaving, please grab this sheet of paper. This is how you get in touch with your legislators. There are actually 2 sheets of paper. So this second sheet includes information on the House Elections and Redistricting Committees, as well as on the Senate Redistricting Committee. Now, it is a little bit small text, so if you can't read it, don't worry. We will follow up with folks with this information via email, as long as we've got you signed up for this event. So we will follow up with this information, but you can also grab a physical copy at the table out in the narthex on your way out. So that is the answer to the first question. Let me pull up some more here.
Could I add something real quick?
Oh, yeah.
Something that's just to be super clear about, congressional district maps have passed the House and the Senate. So, of course, I think that like having regular communication with your legislators is important, especially about the bills that they're going to vote on in the future, such as House and Senate district maps and on these voter suppression bills. But they can't take back or change their votes now. This is on the governor's desk. So at this point in time, if you oppose the Ad Astra 2 map, which I suspect most of us do, I know that our organization is working in the Fair Maps Kansas Coalition in opposition to this racially gerrymandered map. Call the governor's office, write op-eds, write letters to the editor, publicly tag her on Facebook asking her to veto this map. If she were to veto this map, a supermajority would have to vote to override her veto. This process could take up to about 60 days now, so there's a little bit of back and forth, but right now is the time to be able to make it so loud and clear and undeniable to the governor's office that Kansans don't support this gerrymandered map.
Thank you. Absolutely. And sure.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to repeat just because I don't think others can hear. What Representative Ballard said is that in order to override a veto, they need 42 votes, and they only have 39 Democrats.
Yes.
But they're
find
going
3 more
to
votes.
find 3 Republicans to switch over.
Right. Right. That's right. That's right. And again, I mean, contacting your legislators still makes a difference regarding the issue of, right, a veto, redistricting, because, you know, of this vote to potentially override a veto. So, again, after you tag Laura Kelly on Facebook, absolutely go back to that sheet, give your legislators a ring. Someone asks a question that I think is a Jamie Schube question, which is, please explain the difference between voting fraud and election fraud, if there is one.
Well, first of all, I want to touch briefly on your legislators. you need to be active in what's going on in the committees. And it can get confusing because the Senate got rid of their election committee. And so it sits in Fed and State. So if you're looking for the bills that are on elections on the Senate side, it's in Fed and State, because evidently we don't need elections committee on the Senate side. The House still has elections. You need to let those chair people and people to know you're watching those bills before they get to the floor. And this is no disrespect for you. You need to find people who can write that don't have a Lawrence address. Because it has more impact if you find friends and family members that can write to those legislators that don't have a Lawrence address. Because there are a number of legislators that just negate, because we're just liberal lefties, and so we don't know what's going on. So that is also very impactful. So voter fraud and election fraud. So really quickly, I get these questions a lot. First of all, your definition of whether it is an intentional fraud or inadvertent fraud. So voter fraud would be if a voter did something that was a violation of a law, an attempt to be able to vote or something like that. And often, like you have to sign your advance ballot, and we compare the advance signatures. Well, you have been bugging your spouse for days to sign it so you get the mail, and finally you're sick of bugging that person, so you sign it for them. That is actually illegal, right? That is a violation of the law. Or you forget to sign it or something like that. And so our office then works to rectify that. That wasn't intentional fraud. That was you were tired of reminding your spouse, right? But we've had situations where maybe a parent has filled out an advance application for their child who's gone, and if that was intentional, then we give it to the district attorney to go look at it. Election fraud would be if you did something in an attempt to change the outcome, whether it's with the machines or something like that that's of the structure. And, I get people ask me and go, well, is there fraud? Well, I can never say with 100% that somebody hasn't attempted something. Our job is to make sure that we make it really hard to get to our stuff. So on our office, all of our systems are air-gapped. They are not hooked on the internet. You cannot get access to any of the tabulating equipment unless you physically got in it. And now I have key card access to our tabulating equipment, so you've got to get a key card to get to that equipment. And once you get in there, I've got 24-hour cameras. So I want to make it really hard for you to get to the tabulating equipment. But we also do a lot of stuff that people don't know. We do a pre-election audit of all the equipment to know that that is public. Anybody can attend it. It's on the Thursday before the elections that shows the equipment is reading the way it's supposed to. We do post-election audits. We check ourselves. We do a thing that's called balance to the ballot. One of the rumors that happened in 2020 was that people were just turning in 100 mail ballots and they were getting counted. There's no way that can occur because we balance to the ballot. So when I do the county canvass, I say, this is the number of voters from that precinct. This is the number of physical ballots that we counted and they match. I don't say, well, there's 200 extra ballots, but we're good, right? Those are the things that keep me up at night on, do we balance? So I think that's a huge part. And here in Douglas County, we're a paper-based system. And as long as I'm clerk, we will be a paper-based system. So we can physically say we have 100 ballots and we have 100 signatures, and so they match. So we try to just make sure that it can't be done.
Thank you. Thank you for distinguishing between individual-based voter fraud versus system-based elections fraud. Representative Ballard wanted me to remind folks that upholding a governor's veto takes 42 votes. So that is sort of the number that we're looking for in case there was not clarity on that. The next question I want to pass along from the audience is, how do we unmask the conservative talking point that they are not doing a power grab but care about fairness and fraud-free elections? So maybe a simpler kind of condensation of that would be like, how do we respond to concerns about fraud?
On redistricting or voting or both?
it seems pretty broad. So, you know,
Well, first of all, I'd have to say that Representative Ballard and those that physically sat through those hearings are amazing people. Because I watched it and I'd have to turn it off because it's a lot to take as you're being told that this is the most, amazing thing, and you're like, no, it's not. That's the biggest question right now with election officials, which is how do we fight back against the misinformation and malinformation that's out there? And there is not a magic answer to it. We have joked about we should get our own bot farm, and we use that to put out good information. And it's a joke, but it's kind of true. We need you to confront the stuff that's on the internet. And as you see people that do stuff on Facebook and Twitter and so forth, we want to say, I'm not going to engage that. But as long as we don't engage that with the truth, and they may not answer the truth, but other people are reading your response, that matters. And we have to start, as election officers, we're trying to figure out how we get the message out there that combats that. But it is hard because that mistruth goes so fast, and I don't have an answer to it at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one thing I can add to that is what we've found consistently time and time again, and this isn't just through the work that we do at Loud Light, but we work in a large coalition with a bunch of different nonpartisan pro-democracy organizations across the state and country. And the polling that we've received through message testing and what have you consistently shows that even those who think that who believe that there's some kind of issue with our elections, they trust their local government, and they trust their local Jamie, right? Whether it's an election commissioner or a county clerk, their local poll workers, etc. And so the thing that so many of us try to do whenever we're talking to folks who have been persuaded by this anti-democracy propaganda is we are just like, but look at this article, look at these statistics, and we try to say fact and just win, and it never persuades someone. What we need to be doing is we need to be consistently clarifying and reminding people what exactly they're talking about. Things like, we know that the 2020 election was the safest and securest election in history. We trust our local election officials to administer elections in a way that makes sense for our community through things like administering early voting, advanced ballot applications and drop-off sites, etc. And so whenever they're saying there's this, global anti-democratic conspiracy and whatever else, and they're going off the deep end in one way or another, bring them back down to reality and be like, what, you're talking about my man Jamie over here? You think Jamie is what do you think is going on here? And try and localize it and really remind people that elections are local. Democracy is local. This isn't some random, person way out of state who's controlling this process. It's, in most of Kansas counties, it's like Earl down the street, right? These are our neighbors. It's our community who's doing this. So reminding people in kind of a positive framing instead of a defensive and attacking way, that's the best way to reach people, and especially talking to those that you know. Arguing with strangers on the internet is not going to change anyone's minds.
Real quick, here's the question that's not getting asked enough. Were you on the ballot? And did you win your race? So when you talk about that there was fraud, you won your race. So it wasn't fraud on your part of the ballot, but it was on the president's part of the ballot? And trust me, if you're going to create a national, global, international system to rig the vote, then the Senate would be 80-20, and the House there'd be 75 House Democrats. It wouldn't stop at president. So I think that's a question we're not asking is, it's kind of like the logic puzzle. If A, the election was rigged, B, you were elected in that election, C, fill in the blank. But we laugh about it, but that is the question we need to start hitting these legislators with. You were elected, so something must have worked.
Yeah, I will say one thing. In Kansas, I've heard a number of these mostly like Republican legislators say, well, even though there was no fraud or no proof of fraud in Kansas, it's about the feeling of voters. And really just clarifying that making people feel better by passing anti-democratic laws does not strengthen democracy. And that we need to really be speaking in fact-based terms whenever it comes to actually changing our laws, not like a PSA.
All right. So we're saying, Jamie, would this guy who's missing a school children production of Mamma Mia try to do election fraud? I don't think so. I don't think so. Thank you again. So a kind of technical question that I think may be more of a Jamie question, but somebody asks, when it comes to local city government changes, our city government task force recommended switching to 6 districts. I've heard that one of those districts would include 5,000 students in student housing. If those 5,000 are all out of town during the primary, how do we make voter access fair?
Well, it's true, which is if you break up those districts into 6 districts, they're going to be just a few precincts, and so you're going to end up with some precincts that have a lot of students. And historically, and in August, and we moved our city school elections to August, November. It's no longer in the spring. We historically do not see turnout. It's the reason why I don't open the campus polling place in August, because 3 people show up. So it is a concern that if you go to the district model, that primary will have some districts that won't have a lot of participation. So I think that just has to be a conversation about how those districts are drawn. And I don't know if they fully have gone to districts yet. So
Yeah, thank you. Well, friends, hey, it is a little after 2:30. Maybe we can catch the second half of Mamma Mia or the Chiefs game. There are 2 more questions in my hand. Unfortunately, I think we need to call it just to respect people's time, especially the time of our incredible speakers. But if the folks who were curious about nursing homes in Southwest Kansas or Catholics and anti-abortion voting want to come talk to our speakers afterward, feel free. Thank you all so much for being here. What a delightful conversation. Great to be with you. Thank you to the people on the internet. And we'll hopefully see you for the next event. Be sure to grab a piece of paper on your way out. Thank you.